Asteroids, global warming, uncontrollable disease, terrorist attacks, and the threat of nuclear annihilation. All are potential catastrophes that threaten life on Earth. Are these simply disasters that could end our very existence? Or are these threats terrifying prophecies from the Bible's book of Revelation that are at last coming true? Are our fears overblown? Or are the infamous four horsemen of the apocalypse at last riding among us in a countdown to Armageddon? Since humans first began to ponder their own mortality, they have struggled to make peace with the concept that their physical world could one day come to a dramatic end. Ancient Egyptians believed certain rituals had to be carefully and endlessly performed to prevent the world from succumbing to terrifying chaos. Ancient Mayans were convinced that the end of the world was approaching. For them, the date was well in the future. For us, it is frighteningly soon. Mayan calendars tell us the world will come to an abrupt end on precisely December 21st, 2012. Today's religions still ponder the end of earthly existence.
Hindus believe that everything renews itself. Even the gods renew themselves again and again. They believe in time cycles that are longer than we can even conceive of.
At the end of each Hindu cycle, the world will be consumed by flame and a new creation will emerge from the ashes. Fortunately for mortals, Hindus believe each of these cycles lasts over 4 billion years. But it is the great monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that have consistently been most concerned and most articulate about the end of the world. Islam is clear that Allah will end the world and judge his creations. But the Quran is careful to point out that only Allah can know when this end will occur. As a result, Muslims spend little time pondering when the judgment will come. The book of Daniel is the first discussion of the end of time in the Jewish Bible that Christians call the Old Testament. In it, Daniel speaks of vivid dreams filled with monsters and turmoil that signal the resurrection of the dead and the closing of days.
In Judaism, there is the idea of the coming of the Messiah and the coming of a messianic age of peace, but there is not a preoccupation or obsession in most forms of Judaism with this idea.
Only Christianity has featured a profound absorption with the end of the world as a central part of its dogma. There is no more vivid example of this fascination than the phenomenal success of what has come to be called the Left Behind series. The books, written by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, have become a publishing phenomenon. Their latest is the 12th in a series that has sold over 60 million copies. They tell a fictional tale of a world left behind after Christ's rapture. Some Christians believe this rapture defines a holy moment when Jesus will suddenly remove from earth those who believe in him. For believers, this event will start a divine chronology predicted in the book of Revelation. Its verses tell of a time of horrible suffering and slaughter that will at last be climaxed by God's final judgment and his creation of a paradise for the righteous. The success of the Left Behind books reveals one fact. Hundreds of thousands of Christians believe the end of the world promised in Revelation is at last close at hand.
The closest I come is I say, our generation has more reason to believe that Christ could come in our lifetime than any generation before us. We have all the signs that are necessary to be fulfilled. Now, that doesn't guarantee he's going to come in our lifetime, but it sure guarantees that everybody should get ready so that they're not going to be left behind.
Today's society is filled with what some see as proof that the end is near. Books, movies, songs, videos, magazines, and simple rumor all prod our deepest fears and bombard our senses with scenarios for the end of time, the arrival of Armageddon. For the believer, evidence of the decline of the world is everywhere. In the rubble of 9/11, many saw the work of the devil's disciple, the Antichrist. Many say that increasing crime, constant warfare, continued nuclear and terrorist threats, and society's moral decay are all evidence that Christ must soon return and the world must be destroyed.
We don't know the day nor the hour that Christ is coming back, but we do know when it's very near. And Jesus said, when you see these signs, lift up your heads and rejoice, because your redemption draweth nigh.
The book of Revelation in the New Testament predicts that God will foreshadow the end of the world with great and terrifying natural phenomena that threaten life on our planet. Scientists today confirm that global warming is now melting polar ice.
We might expect to see wholesale melting of the Greenland ice cap, which is really suffering now, and widespread melting in Antarctica. And then you're talking about 20, 30 feet of sea level rise. And that's sufficient to flood every major coastal city.
Medical authorities predict a major pandemic is waiting to spread disease and death across the world.
Could a major epidemic of influenza happen again? Of course it could. Would the effect be devastating worldwide? Of course it would.
And our very existence is threatened by a terror from the stars over which we have almost no control.
It's not a question of if. We will get hit by a huge asteroid. It's only a question of when. And every morning that you wake up, there's about a 1 in 20,000 chance that something a half a mile across or bigger is going to hit Earth that day.
Of all the world's religions, only Christianity provides a detailed account of God's destruction and judgment. The story is presented in a book of visions and supernatural prophecies known as Revelation. Filled with nightmarish beasts, terrifying horsemen, and gory slaughter, this fantastic book can be frightening and very confusing. But the overall intent of Revelation is to present a dramatic scenario of Christ's return and the end of the world, an event known as the Apocalypse, or Armageddon. With Revelation as their inspiration and guide, many Christians are certain that Christ's return will happen very soon. The prophecies are inspired. Earthly life is coming to an end.
The Bible is true, and we can trust the Bible to be fulfilled in our time. So the more you know about prophecy, the better equipped you are to live today. It's not something that's reserved for the crazy kooks out in the fringe of life.
But in recent years, news accounts have been filled with people on the fringe who have been convinced they were witnessing and part of the end of time.
In the late 20th century, there was heightened interest in the idea of the end of the world, particularly because of the specter of nuclear warfare. And for the first time, man was faced with the prospect of his own annihilation. And this is very frightening to all of us. And that particularly led to the rise of various cult groups.
In 1978, Jim Jones, the charismatic leader of the People's Temple Church, preached the imminent end of the world. He persuaded over 900 members of his congregation to join him in a mass suicide so that they could find paradise on another planet. In 1993, David Koresh convinced his Branch Davidian sect that he was God in the flesh, and that the Armageddon predicted in Revelation would arrive in the form of a confrontation with the government. When federal officials tried to enter the Davidian compound, Koresh took literally the words of Revelation. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire pours from their mouths, consumes their foes. Revelation 11:5. Over 75 people joined Koresh in a fiery cataclysm. In March 1997, members of the Heaven's Gate movement became convinced by their leader, Marshall Applewhite, that a UFO would rescue them before God destroyed the world. To escape Earth and meet the UFO, 39 members of the cult died in the largest mass suicide in American history. Today, the world is witnessing a new wave of apocalyptic fervor based on the book of Revelation. For many, its prophecies offer a haunting vision of what's to come. Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. Our planet struggles to deal with natural threats and disasters that seem to be ever more dangerous. From 1970 to the year 2000, the number of people affected by natural disasters grew from 70 million to 200 million. At the start of the 21st century, it was estimated that 1 in 30 people suffered from some sort of natural calamity. Scientists tell us that increasing destruction has to do with a rapidly growing world population and dangerous living conditions created by poverty. But the force of natural threats can be very intimidating, and there are things even science can't explain.
Certainly science can't predict the death of the human race itself. And this is something enormously frightening to us, that there's something that's beyond our control. Naturally, our minds race forward to try to come up with different end scenarios, different ways that the world might end. Some of these are based in science, and some of these are based in faith.
Millions of Christians have become convinced that the potentially devastating threats to Earth are apocalyptic signs that the end of the world is coming. For these Christians, the source to understanding the threats to our planet lies not in science, but in one book of the New Testament. The predictions of Revelation have always spawned debate and argument. The book tells of God's assurance of punishment and God's promises of paradise. Both troubling and uplifting, the Bible's final book was born out of oppression. It is the year 90, some 60 years since Jesus' crucifixion. The world of the Eastern Mediterranean is ruled with an iron hand by Rome.
I don't think there were any crucifixions going on at the time, but there certainly was a very bad situation going on. Jesus had been executed by the Romans. Nero had had his fun with the Christians in Rome, and it could happen again. So there's a, it's a kind of a black cloud hanging there, and you never know when it's going to rain.
Its armies have destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Its emperors have persecuted those who follow the Christ. The Romans condemn an early Christian preacher to exile on Patmos, an island off the coast of Asia Minor that is today Turkey. His name has come down to us as John of Patmos, or St. John the Divine. In the face of continued and systematic Roman dominance and cruelty, he writes letters to 7 churches in 7 cities in Asia Minor.
I think John writes to console and fortify the Christian believers that indeed they are on the side of the forces of good, and whatever troubles they're experiencing, Jesus will soon return to give them the final reward.
He urges them to hold tightly to their faith and be assured that in a world of tyranny and evil, God and his Son Jesus will prevail. Legend has it that John wrote the words of Revelation while living in a cave on the island. But John tells us these words of Revelation are not his alone. They are a product of a series of dramatic visions revealed to him by God. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him, to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. The Bible tells us that the angel who appeared revealed stunning visions of Christ's ultimate triumph, God's final judgment, and the eternal paradise that awaits the faithful. Finally, John is commanded to write these visions down. Write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches. Revelation chapter 1, verse 11. The fantastic story and often horrifying images presented to John not only affected the early Christians of the 1st century, they have remained to this day to encourage, to inspire, and often to terrify. Revelation's message is complex and often mysterious, meaning many things to many people.
The Revelation takes us on a journey to the heart of God.
There are stories within stories opening out like Chinese boxes. This is not a simple book.
To understand the complex message of the book of Revelation, we must understand the time in which it was written. After Jesus' crucifixion, the infant Christian church had moved from Jerusalem and Galilee to spread through the Roman provinces of the eastern Mediterranean and on to Rome itself. Cities in Asia Minor, such as Ephesus and Pergamum, were prosperous and important outposts of Roman commerce and culture. But in less than 50 years, these and other cities had also become the home of the young and growing Christian church. In the year 81 of the Common Era, Domitian became Emperor of Rome. Worship of the emperors as gods had been practiced in some form since Rome built an empire. But Domitian now erected a temple to himself in Asia Minor and insisted that all his subjects worship his image as God. Almost as disturbing was the constant pressure on Christ's followers to give in to Roman cultural values at home and in the marketplace, to think of themselves first as Romans and not as Christians. This cultural assimilation was deeply abhorrent to John of Patmos. To the church at Ephesus, he wrote this criticism: "You have forsaken your first love. Remember the height from which you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die." Revelation chapters 2 and 3. But John does not offer only admonishment. He also gives encouragement, this time to the Christians of Smyrna. "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you a crown of life." Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. By the 4th chapter of Revelation, John stops speaking of the present. Instead, he begins to reveal the unimaginable things the angel has shown him of God's plan for the future. But in order for John to communicate all this, he had to disguise his real meaning from Roman eyes. In a Roman world, John wrote in Greek, not Latin. But that wasn't the code he used. He chose to write in a unique style that only his reader would understand. The style is called apocalyptic. The word apocalypse is often used as a synonym for the end of the world, but that isn't the real meaning of the word.
The very first word of the book is the Greek word apocalypse, which means pulling back the curtain, unveiling something. And that's what Revelation does, is take us on a journey of unveiling. And what it's unveiling is the Roman Empire and its injustice, and then it's giving Christians a message of hope. It's showing them that the true power behind the universe isn't the Roman emperor, it's God who sits on a throne, and Jesus, the Lamb.
Most scholars agree that John used vivid symbols, whether describing a legendary whore, riding a terrible beast, or the devil himself. John knew his readers would recognize these icons as symbols of Rome. Like the book of Daniel, Revelation relies on fantastic images to convey its message. Debate over the meaning of these images has made Revelation the most controversial book in the Bible. Most scholars see John's writing as a series of metaphors.
So if he's talking about Babylon, he's not talking about the place between the Euphrates and the Tigris River, where the historical Babylon was. He's talking about Rome. And if he's talking about various kinds of beasts, he's talking about emperors.
John could not afford to have his words understood by the Romans. So, scholars maintain, he relied on a coded language that would have been familiar to his readers. But to modern Christians, this language is often obscure and mysterious.
The book of the Apocalypse is immensely loaded with symbols. The writer is coming out of a very dense and complex set of metaphors and realities which he's taken by and large from the earlier scriptures.
John's readers were well versed in the Jewish Bible. Both the books of Ezekiel and Daniel contained apocalyptic passages to offer hope to the Jewish people. When the Babylonians conquered the Jews and made them slaves, Ezekiel sought to convey a sense that God would protect his people and destroy their enemies. To do this, he wrote of wild, surrealistic scenes, such as a field of bones coming to life. And the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood on their feet, a vast army. Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 2.
The problem is when we take the Old Testament symbolism that St. John was thinking about when he wrote the book and tried to put it into the modern world and understand it in a scientific way, it just doesn't make sense.
But for many modern Christians, Revelation makes perfect sense. It's not about symbols or code. It is about literal truth. For these Christians, Revelation is no myth. It is a living, breathing prediction of the end of the world that can happen at any time. Pastor and televangelist John Hagee of the Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, is very direct in preaching to his congregation. At any moment, Jesus will call those who believe in him to depart this world.
The Lord in the air. The next exciting thing that's going to happen to the church is we're going to be in the presence of Jesus Christ. Keep your lamps lit and your wedding garments on. We're getting ready to leave this place in the twinkling of an eye.
Hagee and congregations like his around the world are adamant that the words of Revelation are not allegorical.
I don't believe they're allegorical. I don't believe they're metaphoric. I believe they are factual. I believe that there will be 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that will represent 4 different specific kinds of terror that will come upon the earth in rapid succession.
The letters of John the Divine are a story like none other in the Bible. No novel or Hollywood screenplay could be more dramatic. It is filled with devils and monsters, horror and slaughter. But could this amazing work also offer messages of hope, comfort, and promise? For almost 2 millennia, human society has often been plagued with a primal fear. It is a fear that sends a shiver of horror down the spine of all who feel it. A horror that our world may be coming to a violent end.
There are many people that feel that the natural disasters we see today are a fulfillment of prophecy. The story of Noah, the promise given by God, he said, I will never destroy the world again by flood. But that doesn't include earthquakes or fire that are described in the book of Revelation.
For most who have become convinced that doom is approaching, this age-old fear has had its beginnings in the last book of the Christian Bible. John of Patmos describes fantastic visions of the future of the world. Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. Revelation chapter 5, verse 1. The figure on the throne is God, and the 7 seals secure a scroll that contains God's plan for the future of his world. As Jesus opens the seals, the verses of Revelation present a countdown to the end of the world. The first 4 seals opened by Christ reveal the most famous imagery of Revelation, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Each of these terrifying figures will lay waste to the world in its own assigned way. The first horseman on the white horse is bent on conquest and war. The red horseman brings the horror of pestilence and disease. The black horseman spreads famine and hunger. And the final pale horseman delivers cataclysmic death to the world. The haunting images of the horsemen are followed by angels emptying 7 bowls and blowing 7 trumpets, each ushering in a new series of torments inflicted on the earth and its people.
The bowls are poured out, and each time the bowl is poured out, another disaster happens.
There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree. During this terrible time of death and destruction, the earth shall be ruled by a figure of deception and malice. It is a servant of the devil, a figure that represents all that is evil. It is one of the most memorable icons of Revelation. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns. He was given power to make war against the saints to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 and 2.
It's a figure that controls everything. Everyone is paying this beast homage. And this beast is dangerous, but everyone is acclaiming the beast as what is to be worshipped.
Satan gives the beast the strength to conquer, and he uses it to slaughter multitudes that follow Christ. Those who survive will be forced to show their allegiance by being branded on their right hands or foreheads with the mark of the beast.
The mark of the beast, everyone wears, and the allegiance to the beast is symbolized by this mark, and the mark is represented by the figures 666, and it marks everyone with its power and its destruction.
With this mark, the beast will be able to identify his followers. Those without a mark will be known as followers of Christ and will be singled out for punishment. Did John mean to suggest that a beast would literally appear, that a 7-headed monster would actually walk on earth? Most theologians believe the beast is a symbol to John's readers of the Roman power and authority that threatened their lives and which tempted them away from Christ.
The beasts of Revelation certainly are the Roman Empire, but I don't think it's a literal kind of one-to-one correspondence that you're supposed to figure out, you know, who is each of these beasts. But it certainly is overall a critique of Rome, no question about that.
Throughout history, many Christians have seen the beast as representing not Rome, but another enemy of God, the Antichrist. This figure would come to have great significance throughout religious history.
The anti means false parallel or opposition. And as Christ was love and holiness and purity and sacrifice, so Antichrist will be the opposite.
The debate over the beast continues, but all agree that the Bible is clear that God will not allow this force to succeed.
God will not tolerate the arrogance of evil indefinitely. Something will happen. It'll be provoked by the arrogance of an earthly king, and that arrogance of the earthly king, the Antichrist, will finally provoke God's decisive movement to bring in the kingdom of God on earth.
After 7 years' rule, the beast or Antichrist is instructed by the devil to do battle with Christ to decide who will dominate the earth. The beast will assemble his army of doom in a great valley that has been the scene of many battles throughout biblical history. The beast's armies shall gather at a place Revelation calls Armageddon. This famous battle site that John predicts for the future actually exists in modern Israel today. It is a place of archaeological exploration. The site is called Armageddon.
We're standing on the very spot that John said the great battle between good and evil would take place. This is Megiddo. This is Armageddon. Armageddon means the mound or mountain of Megiddo. And from Armageddon we get Armageddon. From Armageddon we get Armageddon. Now it's no coincidence that John chose this particular site for this great final battle, because this little valley, the Jezreel Valley, has seen more battles than any other place on earth. In the last 4,000 years, there have been 34 battles fought in this small piece of land. The names of the people who have fought and died here reverberate throughout history.
The Egyptians, Persians, Mamelukes, Napoleon all fought in this valley.
John knew what he was doing in putting the Battle of Armageddon here, just as if we were to mention to an American the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Shiloh. So a mere mention of Armageddon or Megiddo would have evoked images of past glory and future revenge to any Christian audience that would have been reading John's writings.
The final battle will be beyond imagining. Revelation says that only a portion of the beast's army will number 200 million. Against them, Christ will lead the way, riding a white horse and commanding his army dressed in fine white linen with the sword of battle coming out of his mouth. The armies of Christ will prevail. In this final fight between God and the powers of evil, the beast will be captured and thrown into a fiery lake of burning sulfur. Satan will no longer be free to devour the world. Christ will now rule, and all will be at peace.
After the battle, there's going to be 1,000 years of perfect peace. It is called the millennial reign, millennial for 1,000. But it'll be 1,000 years of perfect peace, in which the lion shall lay down with the lamb. Men will beat their swords into plowshares and study war no more.
In the last chapter of Revelation's great story, with the final judgment at hand, the dead of all time will be raised from their graves and come before God and his Son. Those who have forsaken God's laws will join the devil in hell for all eternity, but the faithful will receive their reward.
The Almighty has done great things for me.
Those who have honored the commandments of God and the teachings of Christ will now enter an everlasting paradise. God himself shall be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. But God had no sooner delivered his amazing prophecy for the future than men began to try to interpret it. Christians today still debate and wonder, will this world soon come to an end? And if so, when? Today, many Christians seem obsessed with imagining the end of time and predicting the timing of Christ's return. But Jesus himself discouraged such speculation. When asked by his disciples in the Gospel of Matthew when he would return, Jesus said, "No one knows about the day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, not the Son, but only the Father. Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. Yet no sooner had Christ left their presence than Christians began to yield to the temptation of setting a date for his return. In the 1st century, Pope Clement I, a disciple of St. Peter, preached that the world would end at any moment. Hilary of Poitiers, an early bishop of the church in what is now France, declared that Christ would return to earth in the year 365. We know nothing of his reaction when Jesus failed to arrive. In the 5th century, St. Augustine became one of the first and one of the few to challenge the literal reading of Revelation.
Which is not to say that Augustine did not believe that the last events proclaimed in the Bible were not going to happen. But what Augustine was resolutely against was any attempt to predict the end and any sense that we could read history out of the events found in the Apocalypse.
In spite of Augustine's pleas to avoid predicting the end of days, as the centuries passed, more and more people continued to set dates for Christ's return. Christian leaders were convinced that the Antichrist was at work and the end was imminent. In the year 1000, the body of the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne was disinterred because of a legend that he would rise to fight the Antichrist. Many believed Christ would return on the 1000th anniversary of his crucifixion in 1033. Throughout the Middle Ages, the horrifying figure of the Antichrist filled Christians with dread. The music of the Middle Ages pleaded for God's forgiveness on the day of anger and wrath. Medieval artists often seemed obsessed with apocalyptic images. Hieronymus Bosch, Peter Bruegel, and Albrecht Dürer were only a few of the artists who filled their work with nightmarish images of the Antichrist and horrifying visions of God's wrath.
It's hard to walk into a medieval church and not find the Last Judgment portrayed either on the entrance porch, the tympanum, or sometimes in paintings and mosaics on the back wall of the church. This was a reminder, are you on the side of the good or will you be consigned to hell?
The story of Revelation, with the beast doing the work of the devil, was a convenient explanation for events that were otherwise unexplainable. In 1347, flea-ridden rats carried bubonic plague from China to Europe. It swept the continent in a tidal wave of unstoppable death. 1/3 of Europe's population died. Pyres burned night and day to consume the corpses. The Black Death was seen as the second flood, a deadly and divine proof that the end was near.
There's a children's nursery rhyme that stems from that. It goes, ring around a rosy, a pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, all fall down. The ring around a rosy is the rash around this bubo that people got. And of course, ashes, ashes, all fall down, we know. And people believe that holding posies, flowers, garlic amulets to their nose would somehow stave off the vapors of the Black Death.
Medieval fearmongers increasingly saw the Antichrist all around them in human form. Jews were among the most popular groups to be cited as doing the work of the devil. But as frustration with the Church of Rome increased, it was the papacy that was identified as the Antichrist by theologians like Martin Luther. I scarcely doubt that the Pope is properly the Antichrist. Everything which he lives, does, speaks, and establishes fits so well. Luther avoided the temptation to set a date for Christ's return. But such reluctance would not continue as Christian history began on a new continent. The discovery and settlement of America supplied enormous spirit and encouragement to those who were convinced of Christ's coming. Religious groups who were committed to the power and truth of apocalyptic prophecy found fertile ground for their beliefs in the pristine New World.
The belief that America has a special prophetic role goes back to the very earliest years of European settlement. And leading Puritan ministers spoke of the new settlement as a shining city on a hill. And this image for a number of leaders blended into passages in the book of Revelation and elsewhere describing the New Jerusalem, the city that will represent the embodiment of the age of righteousness.
Calvinists, Anabaptists, Quakers, Puritans, and other fervently religious groups made their way to America and rallied around apocalyptic leaders. Leaders that proclaimed the end of the world was near. None of these leaders was more passionate and outspoken than Cotton Mather. The son and grandson of Puritan preachers in Boston, Cotton Mather was convinced of the devil's presence. From his pulpit, he warned that the world would come to an end in 1691.
Cotton Mather's a fascinating figure in this whole story because his writings are almost literally saturated with apocalyptic anticipations. Mather was one of the great date setters. He boldly announced a succession of dates, and when the date would pass, he was undeterred. He would go back to the drawing board and pretty soon come up with a new date.
Many colonial Americans saw signs predicted in Revelation everywhere they looked. Earthquakes, terrible storms, ships lost at sea, all could fuel shrill apocalyptic predictions from colonial pulpits. Some believed the mysterious and fearsome Native Americans were agents of the Antichrist. As America moved toward declaring its independence, the identity of the Antichrist shifted to King George III himself. But perhaps the most famous prediction and most dramatic event in the history of apocalyptic America came not from a theologian, but from an early 19th century farmer and preacher from upstate New York. His name was William Miller. Fascinated by biblical prophecy, Miller knew his Bible and was particularly attracted to one verse, Daniel 8:13 and 14. How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be cleaned. Miller was sure this verse was a mathematical guide to Christ's return. After elaborate calculations, he confidently predicted a date. Jesus would appear during the year 1843. Beginning in the 1830s, Miller crisscrossed the northeastern United States with his powerful message of the Second Coming. His public preaching quickly attracted thousands of believers, and his rapidly growing flock soon became known as the Millerites. In huge tents and tiny chapels, Miller spread the word. His many followers believed in their teacher's prophecy. Jesus was coming.
And as that date approached, a kind of frenzy caught large parts of the Northeast, certainly, and crowds were assembled, great revivals were held, public newspapers and magazines were published, charts and graphs were distributed widely.
But as 1843 came and went, Miller and his followers recalculated the date. This time, all were confident. There was no mistake. Christ would reappear precisely on October 22nd, 1844. On the chosen day, Millerites gathered at the prophet's farm. As Miller himself waited and prayed in his study, hundreds stood on a large rock outcropping to await their Lord's arrival. Many had sold everything they owned. All had eaten what they believed would be their last meal, and each quietly awaited the end of their time on earth. As the hours passed, people prayed, sang hymns, and clung to the hope that their Savior would still arrive. But as the chosen day continued to ebb away, the truth at last was clear. All hope was finally gone.
And there are vivid passages of believers describing the weeping and the sorrow when the night came, the day ended, and it was clear that they were wrong. But out of the ashes of the Millerite movement arose a very powerful, large denomination, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is still very interested in Bible prophecy, but carefully avoid stage setting.
America in the 19th century was marked by a wide diversity of approaches to millennial thinking. But perhaps the greatest impact on American apocalyptic thought came not from an American, but an Englishman. As William Miller was preaching his message to his followers, an English minister named John Nelson Darby developed a theory that included an event he called the rapture. Although never actually mentioned in the Bible, Darby insisted that the rapture will be a divine moment when God will call his faithful to heaven to witness the end of time. Today, many Christians believe in the rapture and accept the preachings of Darby as the scripting of Christ's return. These Christians fervently hope that one day soon they will be called by God to witness the end of the world. They are convinced that Revelation's prophecy is coming true. The end is close. The Redeemer is near. God sent his angels to show the things that must soon take place. Behold, I am coming soon. It is entirely possible that at this moment, somewhere in the vastness of space, an asteroid is hurtling on a direct course to collide with Earth. As it gets nearer, its size will become apparent. An asteroid no bigger than a small building could destroy a city the size of London. A half-mile across could destroy a small country. A larger asteroid could be a tumbling horror of galactic destruction that is almost impossible to imagine. 65 million years ago, an asteroid 6 miles wide hit the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Its impact threw huge amounts of debris and dust into the atmosphere. The dust cloud obscured the sun's rays. Plant photosynthesis ended. It is estimated that over 60% of the Earth's species vanished from the darkened planet. It is a statistical fact that sometime in the future, it will all happen again.
There are approximately 700,000 asteroids between Mars and Jupiter, and some of these will eventually come hurtling towards Earth as they have in the past.
Asteroids are only one of many threats to the small planet on which we live. From earthquakes to rising ocean levels, from supervolcanoes to devastating tsunami waves, humans are confronted with forces that could challenge or even end life on Earth. Most scientists view such threats as the random acts of an endlessly changing planet within an endlessly changing universe. But many fundamentalist Christians believe today's threats are unique. For them, recent disasters and the threat of even worse to come are proof that prophecies from the book of Revelation are at last coming true. God will soon eliminate all that is wicked by destroying this world. Could it be that Revelation's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have at last begun their fearful ride?
Well, Jesus made plain that the end of days would not be a peaceful time. There would be political upheaval, war against nations increasing. There would be increasing earthquakes and these sorts of things. And from what I'm reading, we are having an increase in these natural disasters.
Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Revelation chapter 6, verse 6. The book of Revelation tells us that as Christ opens the first 4 seals on the scroll of God, he will set loose on the world the infamous riders of doom, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Each will ride a horse of different color, and each will deliver a series of tribulations and punishments on the unrepentant. The punishments will match the greatest fears of mankind. Although there has historically been disagreement about the exact meaning of each of the 4 horsemen, the first is generally regarded as the Antichrist. Astride a white horse, this rider's goal is conquest, and his apocalyptic mission will be to bring war to the world. If mass warfare is one of the indicators that the end of days is coming, the signs are certainly present. In recent decades, war has ravaged human society as never before. In the 1990s, over 100 million people died in warfare. Today, war takes its toll on almost every continent. Drug wars, civil wars, guerrilla wars, declared and undeclared wars. There are currently 21 different wars raging that kill a human being every 2 minutes.
However, if one looks at indirect deaths due to war, for example, genocide, planned political killing, famine due to war, then that figure is even more staggering. About once every 20 seconds in the 20th century, somebody died as a direct or indirect result of warfare.
Warfare is nothing new to the human race. But in the middle of the 20th century, war took on a new potential for unimaginable slaughter. The rider of the great white horse of the apocalypse had a new weapon in his quiver of horror. One that could destroy the entire world in a matter of hours. Today, even with the Cold War long over, 8 different countries still possess a terrifying arsenal of over 40,000 nuclear warheads. Iran and North Korea stand poised to join the frightening club of nuclear powers. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the technology exists for skilled terrorists to create nuclear weapons the size of a suitcase. For some Christians, a specific verse of Scripture predicts that nuclear warfare will begin in the Middle East and ultimately consume the planet.
And that's in Zechariah 14:12. And this is the plague that God shall bring against every nation that attacks Jerusalem, that while they yet stand on their feet, their flesh shall be consumed, and their eyes shall melt in their sockets, and their tongue shall melt in their mouth. That's why when a nuclear bomb is dropped, the flesh can be burned off of your body before your corpse can hit the ground. That makes me to believe that there will be a nuclear exchange in the future in the Middle East.
But the horrors of the White Horseman are only the beginning. 3 more riders will gallop from the pages of Revelation to punish the world. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. Revelation chapter 6, verse 4. Some believe the rider of the red horse will be sent to bring war, but others think this rider will punish the world with the ancient specter of pestilence. In the Middle Ages, people believed that bubonic plague would end the world. Today, even with the triumphs of modern medicine, many are convinced the Red Horseman is riding again, spreading new apocalyptic diseases.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, I think they've always been in the land. All those old germs that we thought were long gone are still around. And as a matter of fact, in all of human history, we've only eradicated 1 germ, smallpox.
In 1918, a new plague, this one named influenza or the Spanish flu, swept the world with a virulence and speed not seen since the time of the Black Death. In the United States, 150,000 people died, over 200,000 in October 1918 alone. Worldwide, the Spanish flu killed 30 to 40 million people. And just as in Europe in the 14th century, many terrified people thought that the end of days had arrived. Today, it is common to assume that modern medicine can prevent a similar scourge. It is a dangerous assumption. The Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, has said that another pandemic is likely, if not inevitable. And this one will exceed the Spanish flu of 1918. Authorities believe a virulent strain of influenza virus is poised to break out of Asia, probably from Chinese farming communities.
What happens is the influenza virus mixes in a chicken, a pig, whatever, and makes a major antigen shifts and emerges as really a brand new virus against which we have no protection. Would the effect be devastating worldwide? Of course it would.
The speed of modern air travel would spread the virus at a much faster rate than the killer flu of 1918.
I'm not convinced we have travel restrictions adequate. Heaven's sakes, the SARS epidemic was started by one doctor in Hong Kong, and he was visited by 14 people who then went and spread the disease to Taiwan, Singapore, and Toronto. And how did they spread it? Through infected air travelers.
In spite of improvements in medical care, it has been estimated such a powerful new influenza virus would kill as many as 200 million people, over 1 million in the United States alone. Other global diseases continue to confound modern medicine. AIDS has killed over 20 million people. Almost 40 million are infected with the disease with no effective cure in sight. And the grim list of new diseases without cures is a long one. SARS, the Ebola virus, Legionnaire's disease, Lassa fever, new strains of cholera, all offer staggering new challenges for medical researchers.
It's frightening to think that diseases such as Ebola and SARS have no known cure. No one has developed a vaccine against them, and the only way to deal with them has been quarantine. A disease like that could arise in the future that could be far more transmittable, and that could create a global pandemic.
Even older diseases like tuberculosis and polio seem to be morphing into new, more deadly forms.
We underestimate consistently the ability of microorganisms to adapt and change to their environment, even if that's antibiotics. We forget that the stuff of evolution, which is genetic change, applies as much to microbes as it does to macrobes.
The threat of modern disease has been made even more alarming by terrorism. Anthrax offers terrorists a potent and terrifying weapon that can spread death on a scale approaching a nuclear explosion at a fraction of the cost. It has been estimated that 200 pounds of anthrax, the weight of about 4 bags of lawn fertilizer, if released over Washington, D.C., would kill almost 100,000 people. But no matter how severe the threat of modern disease, it is unlikely that any microbe could bring on an epidemic of truly biblical proportions. Scientists believe that even AIDS, or some new strain of flu, cannot bring on the end of the world.
I continue to believe it'll be a dangerous world out there, epidemiologically. But I think it's not hopeless and we're not helpless. I do not see the world ending with an apocalyptic plague.
But many do see other apocalyptic horsemen riding through a troubled world. For them, there are signs everywhere that we are getting closer and closer to Armageddon. The book of Revelation tells us that Jesus will open the third seal of God's plan to reveal a third horseman of the apocalypse. I looked, and there before me was a black horse, its rider holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice, saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages." Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. Most theologians agree that the scales this horseman carries represent the marketplace of food. The quart of wheat mentioned in the scripture is a meager wage and suggests hunger and starvation, for the black horseman will ride to sow the awful seeds of famine. The ability of our planet to feed its population of over 6 billion is becoming increasingly strained. Over 1 billion people struggle to scratch a living from land that is rapidly drying up. The news media brings us scenes of the ongoing drought in sub-Saharan Africa. But drought is also devastating regions of Central Asia, Latin America, and India. The causes are many: deforestation, overgrazing, bad irrigation practices. Each year, 25,000 square miles of land are being swallowed by desert sand. And the situation is likely to get worse, because one overriding fact is threatening the globe. The Earth is getting hotter.
It's hotter now than it's ever been for the last 400,000 years. Not only that, but the worst case forecasts for the next 100 years are that it could be between 7 and 10 degrees Celsius hotter by 2100. We've never seen the Earth heating up at the rate it's heating up at the moment. It's a devastating situation.
Since 1990, the world has experienced the 15 hottest years in recorded history, and the 5 hottest since 1997. Most scientists are convinced the burning of fossil fuels is contributing enormously to the problem of global warming. The results are easy to see. The most immediate effect is that the world's ice caps and glaciers are melting rapidly.
Glaciers all over the world have been melting back for the last several decades. Glacier National Park in the States hasn't got many glaciers anymore, so that'll have to change its name soon. Kilimanjaro, with that classic patch of ice and snow on the top, that's expected to disappear within 10 years now.
For the first time, the North Pole has become largely ice-free in the summer. Areas of Greenland that have not seen the sun in tens of thousands of years are now being exposed from under the ice. All of this melting is having profound effects. Rapid global warming is the problem, but in some places, increasing cold might be the result. Cold, fresh water from melting ice is pouring into the North Atlantic, where it meets the warm waters of the Gulf Stream flowing north from the Caribbean. The fresh meltwater now threatens to dilute the Gulf Stream, preventing it from returning to the tropics to be reheated.
So we are probably, before very long, and very long being anywhere from 1 to 20 years, are going to see temperatures start dropping by as much as 10 degrees in the United States and as much as 20 degrees on average in Europe. If temperatures drop as much as we think they might, you will see phenomenon like the Hudson River freezing solid every year, the Chesapeake Bay freezing solid every year.
Scotland and northern England will become subarctic. Snow will blanket Paris and London. The effects on farming will be disastrous. The difference between a full ice age and the current climate is only about 7 degrees. Without the Gulf Stream, many predict the climate in this part of the world will become up to 20 degrees colder. Perhaps the most alarming result of all this melting ice is that the level of the world's oceans is starting to rise. If the Greenland and Antarctic ice caps melt entirely, a very real possibility, sea levels may increase by a terrifying 30 feet by the end of the century.
And added to that, wave heights are getting higher as well, because we're getting increased storminess in parts of the world.
Every major coastal city in the world, from Boston and Miami to Bombay and Singapore, will lie underwater, and islands throughout the world will disappear entirely. Rising seas that engulf the land would appear to confirm the frightening prophecy of Revelation 16:20. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. The effects of global warming are already beginning to have serious consequences for agriculture throughout the world. Rising temperatures and dramatically diminished rainfall are reducing crop yields in many parts of the world that can ill afford it. But worse could lie ahead. Demographers say that by the end of the century, there may be as many as 3 billion more mouths to feed.
It will be extremely difficult to grow crops to feed the expected population at the end of this century, which will be at least 8 or 9 billion. I think we'll really have to struggle. And finding water for them to drink is going to be an even bigger problem. Potentially, we can easily see famine in biblical proportions in the second half of this century. It wouldn't surprise me.
The evidence is very clear. The world is undeniably becoming warmer, perhaps critically warm. The question is, what can be done? Many who believe this dramatic climate change was foreseen in the Bible believe that nothing can be done. But others do not accept that this crisis is unavoidable.
I don't think that's the way forward. I think we need to change the way we live. Simple as that.
It seems to me that it's human nature, and wise human nature, to survive. We've learned that we should care about our own survival, and we've learned that we can control a lot about our own survival.
Scientists assure us that better farming and forestation methods can keep desertification in check. They point out that cutting back on fossil fuels will help slow down the alarming rate of global warming. The black horse of Revelation doesn't have to deliver his punishment of famine. However, there are other grave threats to our planet and our lives over which we are helpless. The book of Revelation is very clear that the four horsemen of the apocalypse will bring terrible times to the world. Theologians differ on the meaning and symbolism of three of the horsemen of the apocalypse, but there is little doubt about the purpose of the fourth. When I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come," I looked, and there before me was a pale horse, and its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. Revelation chapter 6, verse 7. If the rider on the pale horse is meant to bring death to the world, the Earth's volcanoes would provide a very effective weapon. Since prehistoric times, humans have gazed with horrifying wonder at the awesome sight of the Earth spewing the force of its molten interior into the air. Romans gave us the word volcano after their god Vulcan, who they believed was pounding his fiery anvil deep within the volcano's fury. And the ancient Hawaiians believed volcanoes were manifestations of the fire goddess Pele. Today we know a great deal about volcanoes. However, we remain powerless to avoid their awful wrath.
There are about 50 volcanoes that erupt every year. That's out of a total of about 3,000 or so. I mean, some volcanoes actually are erupting nearly all the time. Mount Etna in Sicily, for example.
Most Americans remember the great eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington in 1980. But this was a small puff of smoke compared to one of the greatest volcanic blasts in recorded history. That was on August 26, 1883, when the island of Krakatoa in Indonesia blew into pieces.
Mount St. Helens threw out enough material that if you diced it up into a cube, would be about a third of a mile by a third of a mile by a third of a mile. Krakatoa in the 1880s blew out an amount of material that was about 20 times that size.
The blast from Krakatoa was heard 2,900 miles away. That would be the equivalent of standing in Philadelphia and hearing an explosion in San Francisco. The enormous tsunamis generated by Krakatoa drove ocean-going ships miles inland. Entire villages were swamped, killing over 36,000 men, women, and children. Death from volcanoes usually comes not from the familiar red-hot lava, but from superheated gases that sweep down from the volcano's opening. Known as a pyroclastic flow, this scalding wind can incinerate people in seconds. In May 1902, Mount Pele on the Caribbean island of Martinique erupted, sending ash and pyroclastic gases down onto the city of Saint-Pierre at its base. 29,000 people died in minutes. But even volcanoes like Mount Pele and Krakatoa were small fireworks compared to the awesome force of what science calls supervolcanoes. We know that these monstrous eruptions have occurred in places as far apart as what is now Yellowstone National Park, most recently nearly 650,000 years ago, and on the island of Sumatra in today's Indonesia. 73,000 years ago, the supervolcano Toba blew open a crater that became this lake. It is over 60 miles across. The ash from the colossal explosion covered an area the size of India to a depth of 3 feet.
Eruptions like Toba and the 3 huge eruptions at Yellowstone over the last 2 million years are in a different league from our everyday common or garden eruptions that we see from one year to the next. The worst thing about these eruptions is that they pump not necessarily the ash into the atmosphere, but the volcanic gases into the atmosphere that are capable of spreading out around the entire planet. They cool the surface very, very quickly because they reflect solar radiation back into space.
Toba's eruption may have been sufficient to cut the sunlight reaching the Earth by 90%. Temperatures around the planet would have dropped by an average of about 10 degrees and as much as 30 degrees at the equator. Today, deep below some point on the Earth's surface, a seismic time bomb lays ticking. A cataclysmic eruption is waiting. One such location could be below the steaming thermal pools and geysers of Yellowstone National Park.
Yellowstone is still restless. It's still going up and down. The ground's swelling. There's earthquake activity going on. So there's still magma down there. And the worry is that at some point in the future, that magma is going to come out again. It's done it 3 times in the last 2 million years, the last time about 640,000 years ago. And on the basis of the cyclicity of those 3 events, we could have another super eruption any day now.
If a supervolcano should erupt at Yellowstone, the whole of the central United States would be devastated under a deep covering of volcanic ash. The great breadbasket of the American prairie states would be barren. Major rivers like the Mississippi and the Missouri would be turned into lifeless mud flows. Another event of apocalyptic proportions is waiting to happen on a volcano in the Canary Islands. Some say it is an event predicted in the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verse 8. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. In 1949, during an eruption of a volcano called La Cumbre Vieja on La Palma Island in the Canary Islands, an immense flank of the volcano began to slide toward the ocean. Over 50 years later, it is still creeping toward the sea. At some point in the future, 1,000 years from now or next week, another eruption will occur. And this enormous mass is going to collapse into the North Atlantic with a thunderous roar.
When it does so, it's going to generate a mass of water, a bulge of water, something like half a mile high. We estimate that the waves, when they hit the US, will be somewhere between 10 and 30 meters high. So you're talking about between 30 and maybe 100 feet high.
When squeezed between bays and river estuaries, this giant wave will become even higher. Any town or city within 20 miles of the coastline of North America could be devastated by this killer wall of water.
The distance between the crest of a tsunami wave and the next crest is hundreds of kilometers. So this water will come in as a wall, and it will just keep coming for about 10 or 15 minutes before it starts to drain out again. So these are devastatingly powerful things.
Perhaps the most common natural disaster threatened in the Bible is one that remains a threat throughout the world today. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' disciples ask him, "What signs will herald the end of the world?" Jesus answers, "And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All of these things are the beginning of sorrows." Matthew chapter 24, verses 7 and 8.
Every year there are about 500,000 earthquakes. Most of them are very, very small, so we can't detect them, but there are perhaps 3,000 that are big enough to damage towns or cities. And every year there are 2 great earthquakes. So if they happen next to a city or underneath it, then you're going to get huge casualties.
Most earthquakes happen along lines where 2 tectonic plates rub against each other, deep within the Earth. The most dangerous zones are in the Western Pacific, along the coast of North and South America, and along the line of the Eurasian Plate in places like Italy, Turkey, and Iran. For many Christians, earthquakes are a powerful forecast of the doom and punishment promised in the Bible.
For the prophecy believer, this simply provides further evidence that the Bible is true, that the environmental catastrophes foretold in the Bible were anticipations of developments that we see in our present age.
I have read articles of earthquakes that are escalating in number and escalated in intensity. I believe that there will be earthquakes because the Bible says there are going to be earthquakes.
But most scientists who study seismic activity disagree.
We don't see scientifically an increase in earthquake activity that might portend, for instance, the end of the world.
For these observers, natural disasters are no more dangerous than they have ever been. Volcanoes, earthquakes, asteroids, and giant tsunamis have been threatening the human race for as long as the species has been on the planet.
They're a normal part of the way the Earth works. Whether you believe that God created the universe and the Earth or not, He created it to work in a particular way, and it's a natural way. These events are completely normal.
But many believe the threats of nature are only some of the signs that tell us that the end of time is near. They are convinced that other prophecies are now coming true. Prophecies that reveal the awful news that Armageddon is almost upon us. Theologians and tyrants, saints and crackpots. People have been predicting the end of the world since John of Patmos wrote down the book of Revelation in the 1st century. All have been united by the conviction that Scripture clearly predicts the end.
There are a number of signs that are given for the end times, and it's interesting to me that everything that needs to be done before the coming of Christ has been fulfilled.
Jesus said to us, when you see these 10 signs, you are the terminal generation. Lift up your head and rejoice. Your redemption draweth nigh.
One of these signs for believers is found in the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation. The verses say that 2 witnesses will appear to urge humans to repent for their acceptance of the beast or Antichrist. The beast will kill them and leave their bodies in the street, where the Bible says the whole world will view them. For 3.5 days, men from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies. Revelation chapter 11, verse 9. The Bible said it, but for the whole world to see such a scene was impossible until very recently.
Now, in my father's generation, it was not possible. Certainly it wasn't possible in my grandfather's generation.
But CNN and Fox News and other means of communication are everywhere, and you could see an event like that all over the world.
The ability to say that we can see those 2 witnesses at one time is proof positive that we are electronically that generation that will see the rapture of the church.
Another piece of scripture that is cited as confirmation that Armageddon is near is found in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4. Close up the scroll and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end, when men shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be greatly increased.
When men shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be greatly increased. That literally translates, there will be a knowledge explosion. So we know that the first evidence the terminal generation has arrived on planet Earth is when there is an explosion of knowledge. So we are that generation.
But of all the many biblical references cited to prove Armageddon will soon be here, none is more referred to than a verse from the 66th chapter of Isaiah. Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. Many believe this moment that the prophet spoke of has already occurred. The prophecy came true in 1948, when the ancient state of Israel was at last officially restored.
The resolution of the Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions. At last, there's going to be a Jewish state.
I was listening to the radio in my home the night we heard that broadcast. I was sitting at the table. My father was a great Bible scholar. He was a man of very few words. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes and he said, this is the most important day of the 20th century because Israel has become a nation again.
Fundamentalists go on to cite other scripture predicting Israel's reclaiming of Jerusalem and repossession of biblical lands as proof that prophecy is being fulfilled.
I think the Hebrew prophets were extremely clear that the Jewish people would return to this very land in the end days before the final climax of history takes place. And since I've been here reporting in Israel, the percentage of world Jewry living here has gone up from 25% in 1980 to over 40% today. So I believe this is literally going to be fulfilled, and this little country is the sign of all signs that we're nearing the end of days.
But others reject the notion that Israel today is somehow a key that will unlock the door to reveal the apocalypse.
What does that say to all the Christians who lived before the State of Israel was founded in 1948? Could Jesus have not returned during their lifetimes? Of course he could have. Jesus can come back at any moment. It's not as if there's a whole sequence of events that must happen in order for him to be able to return.
Many evangelical Christians believe that one part of the puzzle of Armageddon is still missing. They are convinced that for the promise of Revelation to begin, the New Testament demands that Jews rebuild their ancient temple in Jerusalem. Their source is in the 11th chapter of Revelation. I was given a reed-like measuring rod and was told, "Go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there." Many fundamentalist Christians have contributed vast amounts of support and money to Jews in Israel who would make the new temple a reality. There is just one problem. The traditional site of the ancient Jewish temple was on what is today known as the Temple Mount, and on the Temple Mount is the Mosque of the Dome of the Rock, one of Islam's holiest places.
We're overlooking the Temple Mount, where God chose for Solomon to build the first temple, when they came back from Babylonia to build the second temple, and where we hope in the future to build the third temple. There are Christians who support the building of the temple because they believe that this will usher in a certain sequence of events towards advancing the end of days. This doesn't bother me in the slightest, because we believe that God commanded us to build the temple, and that we have to do so, and once we do so, God will be in charge, and what will be will be.
What will be may be an explosion of outrage by Muslims. Many in Israel charge that support for rebuilding the ancient Jewish temple risks further inflaming Middle East tensions.
When Christian fundamentalists encourage and support the tiny Jewish groups that are interested in agitating toward the destruction of the Muslim shrines, you are talking about supporting setting the Middle East in flames.
Still, other Christians solve the problem by suggesting the temple will be rebuilt, not in contemporary times, but during the Antichrist's rule on earth.
I believe he will have power to impose it on the Jewish people and the Muslims here. He will do the rebuilding. However, I do see the Messiah entering into that building when he comes back.
For almost 2 millennia, people have been convinced the figure of the Antichrist is real and living in their midst. Today, many still believe this frightening servant of the devil will soon appear. For some Christians, the end of the world is not an event that may take place at some point in the unimaginably distant future. For these believers, signs are all around us that Armageddon is almost here. The face of their religion will soon be joined by another. This one will be the face of deception and evil. The book of Revelation calls this figure the Beast, but most of history has known him as the Antichrist.
The early Christians debated over whether Antichrist would be the devil incarnate, just as Christ was God incarnate. But the majority viewpoint that develops is Antichrist will be not the devil incarnate, but the single individual human who is most under the influence of the devil.
In the Middle Ages, the Antichrist was believed to exist in as diverse forms as Pope, a variety of prominent religious dissidents, Jews, or even animals. Those suspected of consorting with the figure of the Antichrist were shunned, exiled, tortured, hanged, and burned at the stake. Fortunately, most of these reactions have disappeared over the centuries, but the figure of the Antichrist is still anticipated and feared.
Well, the anti means false parallel or opposition. And as Christ was love and holiness and purity and sacrifice, so Antichrist will be just the opposite.
It is believed that the Antichrist will have the ability to convince many people to follow him, but he will lead them not to happiness and glory, but to death and hell.
So how will the world recognize this monster? He is going to be an orator. I believe that the Antichrist will come out of Europe. I believe that he's going to come first as a man of peace.
Many are convinced the Antichrist will appear, or has already appeared, from within some global organization, such as the United Nations or the European Union.
He will cause a one-world government. We see that coming right now. There will be a one-world currency.
After he subdues the world through a combination of charm and terror, Revelation tells us the Antichrist will make everyone wear a mark to reveal their allegiance to him, their new master.
He will force every person on the planet to take a mark in their right hand or their forehead. Without that mark, they cannot buy nor sell. He will cause himself to be an object of worship.
Revelation says the mark of the beast will be the number 666. Some believe a numerical mark is already being established by the devil in the products we buy and the credit cards we use. When the Antichrist arrives, his mark will already be among the people. Others see the mark of the beast in the barcodes that are attached to our purchases. For believers, these items are seen as marks to guide the Antichrist and the devil to our doors.
I suspect it would be some sort of an economic mark, as many believe, possibly connected to credit cards. We see today that numerical lines are very important. That's what identifies our credit cards. So I think we see the system for this final mark in place today.
In modern times, many figures have been identified as the Antichrist, from Adolf Hitler to Mussolini, from Henry Kissinger to Ronald Reagan.
There were some who argued that Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist on the basis of the fact that each of his three names, Ronald Wilson Reagan, has 6 letters. So from that you get 666, the mark of the beast.
For many theologians, this literal reading of the scriptures is not only wrong, but a tragic misreading of the Bible.
It's very much a pick and choose kind of literalism that they use, where they'll take certain Bible passages and say this must literally happen in the Middle East or other places. The Bible is not a horoscope. It's not God's playbook of disasters that must happen. Prophecy doesn't mean prediction.
Is the Antichrist among us and the world near its end? Could the predictions of death and destructions written by John of Patmos finally be on the verge of coming true? Most scientists believe that the physical threats to the planet, while serious, are not capable of destroying the human race. They are not the signs of the end. There are impending solutions to even the most horrifying threats, such as asteroids.
The Earth actually moves through space, its diameter, in just 7 minutes. So if we want to make an asteroid miss, we only have to change its orbit a tiny little bit. If we attach a rocket engine, rocket motor that has low thrust over a period of time, it could only take a few months for it to nudge that asteroid so that it misses.
Why then do so many look around the world and see approaching doom?
I suppose we all have a tendency to see our present moment in history as unique and different from everything that's gone before. And I think fundamentalists and prophecy popularizers are particularly vulnerable to that tendency.
Whether God is preparing to bring about the end and call his faithful to him as described in Revelation is known only to God. Are we now in a countdown to Armageddon? Perhaps the best prediction of God's timing for the end of our world is to be found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 36.
No one, not the angels in heaven, not the Son himself, but only the Father knows the time. If you take that literally, then what you have to do is stop speculating and just live faithfully as best you can.